Deep within the arid, wind-swept corridor of the Gansu province in north-central China sits a dusty, unassuming village on the edge of the Gobi Desert. To the casual observer, the village of Liqian appears indistinguishable from thousands of other rural settlements scattered across the vast hinterlands of the People's Republic. The architecture is modest, the roads are often unpaved, and the rhythm of life is dictated by the harsh seasons of the high desert. Yet if one were to walk the streets of this remote outpost and look closely into the faces of its inhabitants, a jarring anomaly would soon become apparent. Among the local population, there are those who possess physical traits that defy the genetic logic of the region. In a land where dark hair and dark eyes have been the dominant phenotype for millennia, one finds villagers with striking green or blue eyes. There are men and women here with aquiline noses, fair skin, and hair that bleaches into a sandy blonde or even red under the relentless sun. For generations, these people were stigmatized, their distinct appearance marking them as outsiders in their own land, subjects of teasing and confusion. They were simply different, and no one knew why. But whispers of a grand and impossible lineage have haunted this village for centuries. It is a legend that connects this remote corner of the Orient with the marble halls of the Occident, a story that suggests these farmers are the living descendants of the most formidable military machine in ancient history. The theory proposes that a lost legion of Rome, defeated in the Middle East, marched thousands of miles east to die, or perhaps to live in China. To untangle this incredible web of history, archaeology, and genetic mystery, we must cast our gaze back over 2,000 years to a time when two superpowers stood at opposite ends of the known world, largely ignorant of one another's existence. In the West, the Roman Republic was in its death throes, transitioning into an empire through blood and conquest. In the East, the Han dynasty was at the zenith of its power, projecting its influence deep into Central Asia. Between them lay thousands of miles of treacherous terrain, hostile tribes, and the silence of history. But in the year 53 BC, a catastrophic event occurred that may have bridged this divide. The story begins with the ambition of one man, Marcus Licinius Crassus. As a member of the First Triumvirate, Crassus ruled Rome alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. While he was the wealthiest man in Rome, having amassed a fortune through real estate speculation and the acquisition of seized assets, he suffered from a deep insecurity. He lacked the military glory that adorned the names of his rivals. Caesar was conquering Gaul, and Pompey had pacified the East. Crassus, desperate to prove his martial worth and equal his peers in prestige, orchestrated an unprovoked and ill-advised invasion of the Parthian Empire, a formidable power centered in modern-day Iran. Crassus marched an army of 40,000 men, including 7 legions and thousands of auxiliaries, into the harsh deserts of Mesopotamia. He was arrogant, ignoring the advice of his guides and the warnings of his allies. He sought a direct confrontation, dreaming of a swift victory that would grant him a triumph in Rome. Instead, he walked into a slaughter. Near the town of Carrhae, in present-day Turkey, the Roman heavy infantry found themselves outmaneuvered by the Parthian cavalry. The Parthians utilized a devastating combination of heavy cataphracts, armored knights on armored horses, and light horse archers. The Battle of Carrhae became one of the darkest days in Roman military history. The legions, accustomed to close-quarters combat where their discipline and short swords gave them the advantage, were helpless against the mobile Parthian archers who rained death upon them from a distance. The Roman testudo or tortoise formation offered some protection, but the Parthian supply lines ensured a limitless stream of arrows. The heat was stifling, the thirst maddening, and the morale of the legions disintegrated. Crassus himself was eventually killed, his head severed and, according to legend, used as a prop in a Greek play being performed at the Parthian court. Of the 40,000 Romans who crossed the Euphrates, 20,000 were killed. 10,000 managed to escape back to Syria, but 10,000 were taken prisoner. This is the crucial pivot point where history fades into the fog of speculation. According to the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, these 10,000 prisoners were not executed. The Parthians, recognizing the value of disciplined heavy infantry, marched the captives nearly 1,500 miles to the eastern frontier of their empire, to the province of Margiana, in what is now Turkmenistan. There, they were put to work as border guards, protecting the Parthian eastern flank against the savage nomadic tribes of the steppes, particularly the Xiongnu, known in the West as the Huns. This is where the Roman trail goes cold in the classical texts. For centuries, historians assumed these men lived out their days in obscurity, intermarrying with the locals and vanishing into the genetic and cultural melting pot of Central Asia. However, in the mid-20th century, a sinologist and historian named Homer Dubs, a professor of Chinese history at Oxford University, proposed a radical hypothesis. He connected the disappearance of the legionnaires in the West with a peculiar military event recorded in the annals of the East. 17 years after the disaster at Carrhae, in 36 BC, the Chinese Han dynasty was conducting a military campaign against a renegade Xiongnu chieftain named Zhizhi. Zhizhi had established a fortress in the Talas River Valley, in present-day Kazakhstan, threatening the stability of the region and the Han sphere of influence. The Chinese general Chen Tang led an expeditionary force to besiege Zhizhi's stronghold. The details of this battle are recorded in the Book of Han, a classic Chinese historical text. As the Chinese forces approached the fortress, they observed something unusual. The historical account describes a unit of infantry fighting for the Xiongnu chieftain that did not behave like the typical nomadic warriors. The nomads of the steppes fought as loose skirmishers, relying on cavalry and mobility. Yet, the text describes more than 100-foot soldiers lined up in a disciplined formation outside the gates. They were drilling in a manner that displayed complex organization. Even more striking was the description of their defensive formation. The Chinese chroniclers noted that these soldiers arranged their shields in a fish-scale formation. Professor Dubs seized upon this specific phrase, fish-scale formation. In the military lexicon of ancient China, shields were typically round or small and rectangular, not designed to overlap in a solid wall. The only known military unit in the ancient world that utilized large rectangular shields capable of overlapping to create a continuous, scale-like protective shell was the Roman legion. This was the testudo formation, the signature tactic of the Roman heavy infantry, used to protect against projectile fire during sieges, exactly the situation these mercenaries found themselves in. Furthermore, the Chinese records mention that the fortress was fortified with a double wooden palisade. This style of fortification was standard practice for Roman military engineering, but was alien to the Xiongnu, who were nomadic and rarely built permanent fortifications, and certainly not with the specific double-layered wood technique described. Dubs argued that the timeline fit perfectly. It had been 17 years since the Battle of Carrhae. The Roman prisoners in Margiana were only a few hundred miles from the Talas River. It is entirely plausible that during the fluid and chaotic border conflicts of the time, a group of veteran Roman soldiers, perhaps having escaped their Parthian captors or having been hired out as mercenaries, found employment with the chieftain Zhizhi. They were soldiers by trade, stranded in a foreign land. Fighting was the only currency they had. The Battle of Zhizhi ended in a decisive victory for the Han. The chieftain was killed, and the fortress was sacked. The Chinese records state that they took over 1,000 prisoners. Among them were the strange infantrymen who had fought with such peculiar discipline. Impressed by their martial prowess, the Han did not execute them. Instead, in a move consistent with Chinese imperial policy of settling captured warriors to guard the frontiers, the emperor relocated these men to a new county created specifically for them. The name of this county is the final, and perhaps most compelling piece of linguistic evidence in Dubs's theory. The town was named Lixian. In the ancient pronunciation of Chinese, Lixian sounds remarkably similar to legion. Moreover, Lixian was the name the Chinese used to refer to the Roman Empire itself, or more specifically, the lands of the West. To name a town Lixian was, in essence, to name it Ro, me, or the place of the Romans. For 2 millennia, the town of Lixian existed on the maps of the Han dynasty, located exactly where the modern village of Zhelizhai now stands. Then, the name vanished from the records, absorbed into other administrative districts. But the people remained. The theory presents a romantic and extraordinary narrative. A group of Roman soldiers, defeated in Turkey, marched to Turkmenistan, fighting as mercenaries in Kazakhstan, and finally settling in China, bringing their bloodline to the edge of the Gobi Desert. If true, it means that the first contact between the Roman and Chinese empires was not through the silk trade or diplomatic envoys, but through the clash of shields and the settling of a lost army. However, moving from historical hypothesis to hard evidence requires more than linguistic coincidences and vague descriptions of shield formations. In recent decades, the spotlight turned to the villagers of Carrhae. The physical distinctiveness of the population had always been a local curiosity, but as the lost legion theory gained traction, it became a subject of scientific inquiry. In the early 2000s, geneticists began to take an interest. Blood samples and DNA tests were conducted on the residents of Lichian to see if there was a European genetic marker hiding in their chromosomes. The results were fascinating, though not definitive proof of a Roman origin. The tests revealed that nearly 60% of the villagers' DNA was of Caucasian origin. This was a significantly higher percentage than the surrounding populations. One villager, a man named Kai Junian, became the face of this phenomenon. With his green eyes and reddish skin, he was nicknamed Kai the Roman by the media. He and others like him spoke of ancestors who were taller and stronger than the average man, and of a local veneration for bulls, an animal oft, and associated with Roman religious practices, though also common in many other cultures. Archaeological digs were also commissioned. If a Roman legion had lived there, they must have left behind physical artifacts, coins, armor, pottery, or inscriptions. The excavations at the site of the ancient city walls uncovered evidence of a settlement dating back to the Han era. They found remnants of fortifications and household items. However, the smoking gun, a Roman denarius, a gladius, or a helmet with a Latin inscription, remained elusive. This lack of specific Roman artifacts brings us to the counter-arguments, which are substantial. Critics of the Dubs hypothesis point out that the Silk Road was a vibrant artery of trade and migration long before the Battle of Carrhae. The presence of Caucasian DNA in Western China is not, in itself, proof of Roman ancestry. The Tarim Basin, not far from Gansu, is famous for the Tarim mummies, perfectly preserved bodies dating back nearly 4,000 years, possessing clearly European features, reddish-blonde hair, and wearing tartan-like cloth. These were the Tocharians, an Indo-European people who inhabited the region millennia before Crassus was born. Furthermore, the region was a crossroads for Sogdians, Persians, Scythians, and other Indo-Iranian groups. The genetic markers found in the villagers could easily be the result of centuries of intermixing along the trade routes, rather than a single injection of Roman blood. The fish scale formation described in the Book of Han could have been a variation of a native formation, or a tactic learned from other Central Asian heavy infantry traditions. The name Lichian might have been a phonetic coincidence or a reference to a different Western polity, not necessarily Rome. The skeptics argue that we are engaging in a form of historical wish fulfillment. We want the story to be true because it is cinematic. It appeals to our desire for connection, the idea that the two great pillars of the ancient world touched hands across the void. The narrative of the weary soldier, fighting his way across the known world only to find peace in a strange land, is a universal trope that resonates deeply with the human experience. Despite the skepticism of the academic elite, the legend has taken on a life of its own in the province of Gansu. For the villagers of Lichian, the connection to Rome is no longer a dry historical debate, it is a matter of identity and economics. The local government, recognizing the potential for tourism, has embraced the theory. A massive portico, built in the classical Roman style, now stands at the entrance to the village. Statues of Roman legionnaires and Chinese scholars standing side by side decorate the public squares. The Roman identity has given the villagers a sense of pride. Where once they were mocked for their colored eyes and strange hair, they are now celebrated as the descendants of emperors and generals. It has put their tiny, impoverished community on the map. Tourists come to see the Roman city of China, to look into the green eyes of the locals, and to buy souvenirs that blend Han and Roman imagery. In a very real sense, the legend has become truth through the sheer force of belief and cultural adoption. But let us step back from the modern tourism and the academic debates to consider the human reality of what might have happened 2,000 years ago. If we accept the possibility, even the remote one, that Dubs was right, the journey of those men is harrowing to contemplate. Imagine the trauma of Carrhae, the blistering heat, the arrows darkening the sky, the death of your commanders, the collapse of the world as you knew it. Then the humiliation of captivity, the march east, away from the Mediterranean, away from vineyards of Italy and the bustling streets of Rome, into the alien landscapes of Central Asia. Years turn into decades, the hope of rescue fades. The Latin language begins to rust on their tongues, replaced by Parthian, then Xiongnu, then Chinese. They would have had to adapt to survive. They would have had to learn to fight alongside men they once considered barbarians. They would have had to marry local women, raising children who looked like them but spoke a different tongue and worshipped different gods. The discipline of the legion, the drill of the shield wall, would have been the one thing they held on to, the one piece of Rome they could carry with them. When they stood outside the fortress of Gigi, arranging their shields in that fish-scale formation, it was perhaps a desperate attempt to assert their identity, a muscle memory of a life left behind. And when they were captured by the Chinese, seeing the disciplined ranks of the Han army, did they recognize a kindred spirit? Did the Chinese generals see in these foreign mercenaries a reflection of their own martial order? The settling of Lixian would have been the final chapter. No longer soldiers, but farmers. The armor would have been beaten into plowshares. The stories of Caesar and Pompey would have become bedtime stories, then myths, then forgotten whispers. The Latin prayers would have merged with local ancestor worship. They died thousands of miles from home, their bones turning to dust in the soil of the Yellow River Basin. Whether the DNA in the veins of the modern villagers is truly Roman, or the result of the complex migrations of the Silk Road, the story of the Lost Legion serves a powerful purpose. It reminds us of the fluidity of the ancient world. We often view history as static blocks of color on a map, Rome here, China there, with nothing in between. But the reality was a porous, breathen, tapestry of movement. People traveled, armies marched, traders wandered. The genetic and cultural legacy of humanity is a story of mixture, not isolation. The absence of a Roman helmet in the dirt of Gansu does not disprove the movement of people. Archaeology is a game of serendipity. We find what survived, not necessarily all that existed. It is entirely possible that the physical remnants of the Legion were repurposed, melted down, or simply eroded by the grind of 20 centuries. What remains is the biological archive, the faces of the people, and the textual echo in the Chinese chronicles. Today, if you visit Lixian, you will see a pavilion with a simple inscription. It speaks of the bond between the East and the West. It honors the memory of the ancestors, whoever they may have been. The wind still blows off the Gobi Desert, kicking up the same dust that would have coated the sandals of the weary travelers 2 millennia ago. The mystery of the lost legion of Carrhae may never be solved to the satisfaction of every forensic historian. We may never find the definitive inscription that says, Gaius was here. But in the green eyes of a farmer in rural China, we find a reflection of a history that is stranger and more expansive than we often dare to imagine. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the drive to survive, to adapt, and to endure, even at the very ends of the earth. The story of the Roman army that died in China is more than a historical whodunit. It is a bridge across the chasm of time and culture. It challenges our perceptions of the boundaries of the ancient world. It suggests that globalization is not a modern invention, but a process that has been unfolding since the first armies marched out of their homelands in search of glory. As the sun sets over the village of Lixian, casting long shadows over the earthen walls that may or may not have once housed the sons of Rome, we are left with the silence of the desert. It is a silence that keeps its secrets well. But as long as there are those with eyes like the Mediterranean Sea walking the fields of the Middle Kingdom, the legend of the Lost Legion will refuse to die. It stands as a monument to the incredible, impossible journeys that define our shared human history. This deep dive into the provenance of the people of Lixian reveals that history is rarely black and white. It is a spectrum of possibilities. The convergence of the Battle of Carrhae, the missing prisoners, the Battle of Gigi, and the peculiar fish-scale formation creates a circumstantial case that is difficult to dismiss entirely. While the burden of proof rests on the discovery of physical artifacts, the circumstantial evidence creates a narrative silhouette that fits the shape of a Roman legionnaire perfectly. We must also consider the geopolitical implications of the time. The Parthians were the common enemy of both Rome, and to a lesser extent, the groups bordering the Han sphere. It is not historically unprecedented for prisoners of war to be used as buffer troops. The timeline of 17 years between the capture of the Romans and the appearance of the strange infantry in the Gigi battle allows for the migration and the transformation of these men from prisoners to mercenaries. Furthermore, the psychological aspect of the soldier's life supports the theory. Mercenary work was the standard fallback for displaced warriors in antiquity. A Roman soldier knew how to do one thing exceptionally well: fight in formation. If they escaped or were released by the Parthians, they would not have been able to return to Rome easily. The path west was blocked by the very empire that captured them. The path east, however, was open. It led to the unknowns of the Silk Road and the L.A. NDS of the Huns. It is a trajectory of survival. The fascination with this story also highlights a gap in our general education regarding the ancient world. We tend to study Rome in a vacuum and China in a vacuum. We rarely study the spaces where they might have overlapped. The Lost Legion theory forces us to look at the map as a whole. It forces us to learn about the Parthians, the Xiongnu, and the complex tribal politics of Central Asia that acted as the transmission belt between the two superpowers. In the end, the truth of Lixian is likely a mixture of all these factors. Perhaps a small group of Romans did make it there, their numbers too few to leave a massive archaeological footprint, but significant enough to leave a genetic and linguistic mark. They may have been absorbed into a larger group of Sogdian or Scythian mercenaries, their distinct Roman identity diluting with every generation until only the faint echo of a fish-scale formation and a town named Legion remained. The villagers of Lixian today are living symbols of this convergence. When they look in the mirror, they see the history of the Silk Road written on their faces. They are the children of the collision between empires. Whether their ancestor was a centurion named Marcus or a Sogdian trader, their existence proves that the ancient world was smaller and more interconnected than we give it credit for. The next time you look at a map of the ancient world, tracing the borders of the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty, do not see them as separate worlds. Look at the vast space between them not as a barrier, but as a bridge, and imagine, amidst the swirling sands of the Gobi, the faint, ghostly sound of a Latin command, ordered by a centurion who walked halfway across the world to find his final resting place. The story of the Lost Legion is the story of the enduring mystery of our past, a puzzle with missing pieces that invites us to dream, to explore, and to question what we think we know about history.